Hello and a very warm welcome back to the garden. It is time for another what to sow video, but this month I'm changing it around a bit. I've got all of the crops in here and I'm going to go to different parts of the garden, starting here within the kitchen garden, and pull out one crop for each one, and I will basically just tell you the top tip or anecdote that comes to my mind for each of that crop, so you get to see what you can grow and sow this month in July, and also get a little bit of a visual update of what's going on around this site. Okay, so let's start with the first crop to sow in the month of July, which obviously works here in the Northern Hemisphere. July is midsummer abundance, and the first one is actually carrot, which is quite fitting because I need to do a bit of a carrot harvest that's growing in the hotbed, and I'm going to preserve a load of these. But carrots, my top tip is to use the plank method to help with germinating. So after you direct sow the seeds, put a plank over the top, and that's just going to help reduce kind of erratic, sporadic germination, which happens when you sow the seeds and then they dry out. And it's the same thing with parsnips as well, which you could, this isn't on the script, but you could also sow parsnips this month. You are going to get small parsnips, but still, a parsnip is a parsnip, and baby veg is pretty trendy, so carrots and parsnips. Next on the list is, I've bunched them together, turnip and kohlrabi. These just grow really, really quickly. My top tip that comes to mind is these are two kind of things that aren't enjoyed particularly well. They're not maybe highest on the ranking in terms of what is considered really tasty vegetables, and so there is no shame if you don't like a certain vegetable in not growing it. So there's a couple of vegetables, like this year I don't think I am actually growing any turnips because I don't need to. I'm not really going to miss them. And so if there's any vegetables or any crops that you feel you ought to grow but you're not really going to eat them, then what's the point of growing them? I always feel that if you're trying to get as much out of your garden as possible, you want to grow the crops that you're absolutely going to be inspired to eat. That's going to help you a lot with self-sufficiency. Next up is beetroot. So beetroot, you can either start off in modules, but I do recommend, wherever possible, direct sowing your beetroot. My favourite thing about beetroot is all of the different varieties that exist. I adore the golden beetroot variety, just the sweetness of it. And cooking it whole, the secret to really good beetroot, and this is something I learned from my good friend and colleague Sam, is to just roast it whole for a long time, and you kind of peel away the outer skin, and it is just so, so tasty. Fennel. Fennel is one of the most delicious crops you can grow. It is a crop that gives you more than one kind of harvest. So not only can you obviously eat the leaves, the fennel fronds, you can use it a little bit like a dill alternative. Roasted fennel bulb, absolutely delicious. But you can also eat the flowers of fennel. Those are really tasty. And then when the seeds start to appear, the young green seeds, you can eat those. And you can also dry fennel seeds and use them as like a herb or a spice in your cooking. I love fennel. Next up is PSB, which stands for purple sprouting broccoli. This is a fantastic vegetable to enjoy over the hungry gap, and July I find is a lovely, lovely time to sow it. So what I tend to do, I've already got the purple sprouting broccoli that is going to be my main outdoor crop next year, next spring. But what I love to do is to start off some purple sprouting broccoli in modules, and then I pot them up into pots, continuing to pot them up. And then once I harvest my chilies or my cucumbers, and there's a little bit of space in the polytunnel, I put in 2 or 3 purple sprouting broccoli plants to enjoy a harvest around 2 to 3 weeks sooner than I would outside, because that's the benefit of undercover growing. Even though I'm sowing the seeds later, I get an earlier harvest. Chard, Swiss chard. I would also include perpetual spinach within this. My favourite thing about chard is just how beautiful it looks. So if you go for a variety like kind of like a rainbow chard or rhubarb chard, bright lights, they are used as an ornamental in some planting schemes that I've seen. Even like going to kind of big stately manor homes where they're all planted up, nice ornamental gardens, they use things like chard, the beautiful yellow, pink stems, the red stems, to add that kind of pop or that flash of colour, and chard is great. You can also harvest it over winter, and I love it. Spring onions. Now, if you are growing onions at the moment, you can use the leaves of onions like a spring onion alternative, but the issue is you're going to be harvesting your onions over the next maybe about 4 weeks, and then you're not going to have those leaves, which you can very easily freeze. But spring onions, I love to use them as a way of plugging gaps that appear within the garden over late summer. So I start them off in module trays, multi-sown. I might do a tray of 40, the 40L from Containerwise, and whenever I see a little gap, I love to just plug in a spring onion. Spring onions are so versatile, and even cooking them on the fire once they're bigger, just kind of giving them a really kind of quick grill, maybe putting over a chimichurri sauce or a salsa verde. So simple, but so tasty. By the way, the aroma within the circle of the rose garden, oh, it's intense. It is so lovely. It's a shame that technology hasn't advanced enough to be able to share aromas like this, but it is pretty special. Dwarf French beans. This actually quite nicely follows on from spring onions. So spring onions I use for plugging gaps. Dwarf French beans I also use for plugging gaps, especially around the sides of beds. They're really fast to grow. The lovely thing about dwarf French beans is, again, you get so many different types of varieties. So you can grow the traditional green ones, but there's also purple varieties and yellow varieties that, again, you're growing it as a food crop, but they do add that lovely flash of colour. Radish. Radish, winter and summer, actually, both of the types of radish, something that you can sow in July. The thing that is nice is that now that the days are getting shorter, that's not the nice part, but it means that there's certain vegetables that are far less likely to bolt or to run to seed prematurely now that the patterns in daylight have changed. And so something like radish, and also the winter radish, is very often like the daikons. If you sow it too early, they're very prone to bolting. But now that the daylight levels are starting to decrease, you can get these sown. For radish, you can sow almost any radish that is circular in shape. Start them off in modules. You can also obviously sow them direct. For something like daikon, I just prefer those to grow direct. I don't want to affect any of the roots as much because I want as big of a root system as possible, but it's just really useful if there's half a row or half a gap open up. That is an opportunity to grow some massive daikon radish. And then you also have all of the other types of radish, like black round Spanish winter radish. Because of that shape, you can start that off in modules and then transplant it, but that is one of the tastiest types. Calendula. This is one of the flowers that I've put in. Calendula is a lovely flower, and if you start it off as early in July as possible, you're going to get some nice colour towards the end of the growing season into autumn. It's something you can also put into your polytunnels to extend the flowering. Calendula is an edible flower. You can eat the petals. You can also eat the leaves of calendula. They're a little bit bitter, but you can put them into salads. So I just thought you should know that calendula, it's not just the flowers that are edible, the leaves are as well, and that's something that I only recently learned. As well as I recently learned that hollyhocks are edible, which is pretty cool. Runner beans. Runner beans, well, technically I could also call runner beans as a flower crop because runner bean flowers are edible. You've got a lovely pop of red. Runner beans originally were grown here in the UK as an ornamental plant when it first came over, but the runner bean flowers themselves, edible, really tasty, a really nice topping to put on salads. But runner beans, they mature quite quick, and so being able to start off your runner beans, and because of their vertical growing habit, you could create a nice structure when you harvest your potatoes or your onions or anything. Put in some runner beans, add that structure, and it's starting to rain, but that's good. It's been nice and dry, a little bit too dry, so I'm actually welcoming some rain, which you probably won't hear any other gardener say that, but with the temperatures, the rain is very useful. Greens is your next crop. I felt it was maybe cheating a bit if I was to include lettuce and spinach and mustard and rocket all as individual vegetables to put on the title just to add as many different crops as possible, but I've combined them into one. There's so many of them available that it is very much worth just looking at the ones that suit you. Now, if you want to try something a little bit different, you could try growing some chicory. Chicory is a really nice one to start growing at this time of the year. Now, obviously, I say greens as in leafy greens, but some of them are purple. It can be, you know, you can have your purple lettuce and everything. But what I like to do for any of the greens, just to prevent them from potentially bolting, especially if you have drier conditions, that's kind of the arch nemesis of lettuce, is really dry conditions. I like to just plant them or transplant them or direct sow them under anything that's growing quite tall, underneath things like climbing beans, but also underneath my stem brassicas. As my kale are beginning to get bigger, I have that space underneath that creates that partial shade that is perfect for growing my leafy greens. Napa cabbage. Napa cabbage, also known as Chinese cabbage, a bit like the radish. It's such a lovely thing to start off. Pak choy as well. I know it's a different vegetable, but it kind of comes in the same realm. That with the shortening days, they perform really, really, really well. Napa cabbage, I love it. It was one of the things that I finally grew properly last year, and I have no regrets whatsoever. It grows really, really quickly. It provides a lot of food in a small space. And one thing I'm going to experiment with Napa cabbage this year is to do a later sowing and to underplant it, maybe under my tomato plants as they're starting to wind down, and then hopefully I'll be able to get some nice Napa cabbage harvests potentially over winter. I want to see if I can prolong its season by keeping it under cover. Next up, we have potatoes. Now, some of you are going to think, he's going to say Sarpomeras. Well, I'm going to say something different. Sarpo Java, I think that's what it's called. Sarpo Java, a different variety. Apparently it's an improved version of Sarpomeras. I am trialing it. I've got a bunch of Sarpo Javas that are currently plants that are growing. I want to see how it performs, and I will feed back. But July, if you can get any kind of blight resistant potato variety. Now the trickiest part is sourcing these seed potatoes out of season, but there always seems to be one kind of niche online garden centre or nursery that has them in stock. Next up is kale. Kale is starting to grow on me a little bit. Usually I only really grow it for the sprouting shoots, but when I realised I could just make lots of garlic butter and mix that in with the kale, I think garlic butter is this isn't mainly the tip, but garlic butter is a useful way for things that taste as good to suddenly taste amazing, and you're very happy eating lots of it, which is good because kale is very healthy for you. My main tip with kale is to probably have really a lot of fun with the varieties, but I would also suggest now is the time to sow a bunch of kale, start them off in pots, pot them on into 1 litre pots, and then when it comes to September time, when a lot of your garden is starting to clear, you can then grow kale and choose different colours. It adds a lot of nice visual interest over winter. You have that hungry gap harvest of all of the flower shoots, and then the flowers are really important forage for beneficial insects nice and early on in springtime. Nasturtium. Nasturtium is another flower that grows really, really quickly, and so if you're like, there's a lot of green areas, I wouldn't mind a pop of colour in a few weeks' time, then grow nasturtium. I would grow nasturtium mainly because you also get the nasturtium seed heads, which you can pickle and use them like capers, which is actually a really lovely thing to do over winter. You can use those capers just to add something else to your salads over winter. And the thing about nasturtium though, if you've never grown it before, if you let it flower and let it seed, it's just going to keep coming back all over your garden every year. But fortunately, it is very easy to pull out wherever you don't want it. Annual herbs. I would say that there are 3 good annual herbs to sow in the month of July. Those are parsley and coriander and also dill, kind of the famous 3. You could do basil as well. That's going to be fine if you continue it under cover. The thing that I would say that my top tip around the annual herbs is, if you do have undercover, even just a hoop bed, then growing coriander over winter works really, really well. Coriander or cilantro is a very hardy herb, and you want to make the most of that. And then early on next spring, it flowers, it runs to seed, and those flowers are enjoyed by beneficial insects massively, and you can also use those flowers to eat, and then obviously the green coriander seeds. Spring cabbage. So spring cabbage, you can treat it almost in the exact same way as I mentioned for kale a little earlier, where you start them off in modules, grow them on in 1 litre pots, and then plant it outside. You get it's so nice to have greenery outside over winter. So provided that you're not in like a really extreme cold zone, spring cabbage is lovely. That is mainly grown for the leaves, and if you do allow them to grow on, they are going to create smallish heads. They're not going to be massive like a normal cabbage, but it's a really nice way to keep living plants in the soil, in the ground over winter, and another welcome use of greenery that also happens to go really well with garlic butter. So yeah, there are a couple of crops that you can sow in the month of July. Sowing is certainly far from over. One of the main things that you need to be doing at the moment is thinking about watering, especially under cover, but also if you're not having that much rain. For watering, there's a couple of tips that I have that I outlined in this video to help you get really strong, resilient plants that are then, as a result, going to give you really good crops. So give that a watch, and I'm going to get back to gardening.